Bonjour, hola, konnichiwa, guten tag. I'm Katy Arnett, and I'm a professor of educational studies at St. Mary's College of Maryland. I am sharing my keynote from the March 2020 CSCTFL conference, Setting the Table, the Case for Inclusion in the World Language Classroom. This is an area I've worked in for nearly 20 years as a teacher and teacher educator in the U.S., with a scholarly focus on inclusive language practice in Canada. The CSCTFL conference was held in Minneapolis right as the country started to shut down for the pandemic. While I have kept my remarks mostly intact, I want to give some quick context to how I delivered the message. I stood behind this table, not a podium, to share my remarks, and I had invited the audience to move over to the side of the ballroom where my table was located. I cued folks to the table at different points throughout the talk, so you'll see the images again in today's screencast. And with that, I will move on to my remarks. This keynote finally started to take shape because of a dream. As a parent of a toddler and preschooler, I live life in naps, not sleep. And sometimes I have interesting dreams in those naps. This dream had me at the table in my office at St. Mary's, and sitting with me at the table were two students who, for me, have been instrumental in my journey as an inclusive language educator. We were talking about, of all things, my 3-year-old's interesting eating habits and my perpetual efforts to bribe them into trying different versions of the food they already love. That's all I remember from the dream, but when I woke up, I immediately wrote down this post-it note: Mary and Melissa at the table. Over my time with you in this screencast, I've decided to introduce you to 4 students whose time with me has helped me evolve as an inclusive language educator, and what their time in my classroom brought to the table for my teaching. I will unpack and reflect on the lessons I learned, both practically and through explorations of and doing my own research about inclusive practice in the language classroom. As the memories of some of my former students join this table, I have 2 requests of you. First, I'm going to invite you to take the stance, at least through my talk today, that diversities and differences of our students represent opportunities to innovate our teaching. Even if this is an area where you're still getting your philosophical or practical bearings, my previous work has shown the importance of entering the conversation with an asset-minded orientation rather than a deficit-minded framing of difference or disability. Second, I'll invite you to reflect on your students whose approach to learning has inspired or required you to innovate your teaching to provide them greater access to language learning. As much as we are told to look at the research for guidance and insight on best practices, the power of our personal experiences cannot be ignored. Let's meet some of my students. In the spring of my first year of college, my French 201 professor asked me if I'd be willing to tutor a student in her French 102 class, David. I agreed, thinking it'd be a quick way to get some extra cash. For me, French was a fun, easy class. French made sense to me, practically without effort. David and I set up our first meeting. At that point, he presented the challenge. He was on his 3rd attempt at French 102, which he needed to pass with a D by the end of the semester to not only graduate, but to complete his acceptance to Yale Divinity School. He disclosed that he had dyslexia, and that because of his dyslexia, how he needed to work with language was different than most other students. He was highly motivated to figure out French and conveyed that he felt it was highly possible to pass the class. After all, he told me, he was already bilingual in English and Hebrew, so he knew his brain could learn other languages. What he needed, though, was someone who could check his brain every day as he was studying the language to make sure that his efforts to reset the letters in his mind ended up in the right order. David was convinced that his difficulty in passing French 102 wasn't because his brain couldn't manage learning the language, but because the supports he had didn't line up with what he needed to do the learning that worked best for him, much like what you see in the image on the screen right now. Admittedly, I had no idea about how I could be that support for David. I also told him that I didn't know how I could, or could not, help him so that I wasn't adding to his challenges. I think I laid out all of these arguments 10 times in that initial meeting, but he was undeterred. He told me that he'd tell me if something I was doing was or was not helping, and where he could, he'd tell me what and was not clear in his head. He asked me just to keep looking for different strategies to try to make French stick in his brain well enough to pass the class. He wanted tutoring sessions every day for an hour. Because David was already bilingual, I didn't even question whether he could learn a language in spite of having dyslexia. At the time, I wasn't aware that within much of the previous decade, there had been court cases and research studies related to whether students with learning disabilities can or should study other languages, particularly at the college level. So from the outset, David's biography and attitude helped me avoid developing one of the more persistent myths about work in this particular area, that language-based learning disabilities preclude or limit one's capacity to learn another language. Though you can't generalize with an N of 1, you can certainly use it as a starting point for asking more questions. Because my first encounter was with a bilingual individual with dyslexia, I have always been immediately skeptical of claims that learning disabilities automatically preclude language learning. Further, because of David's view that it wasn't about how his brain worked that caused his challenges in learning French, but rather how the teaching strategies did or did not line up with his needs, I've also been skeptical of explorations of inclusive teaching that blamed the student's brains and emotion rather than questioned the beliefs and practices at work in the classroom. Thus, to summarize some of the research lessons I've since learned that trace to my experience with David, there is no cognitive barrier to multilingualism. It's possible for an individual to experience dyslexia in one language, but less so or not at all in another language. Now, that wasn't necessarily the case with David. He experienced it across all languages, but we now know through other research in multilingual settings that language dyslexia is not necessarily a cross-linguistic phenomenon. We also, from Vygotsky, who you may know from his ZPD and scaffolding work, he was actually a researcher initially focused on the lives of children who were living in institutions in Russia. And he put out the idea that disability can be compounded by a lack of support in a setting. This lens is important because it lays the foundation for the broader sociocultural theory that has been traced from his work. Sociocultural theory is a bridge that I use to explore both second language context and inclusive contexts and bringing them together because of their interest in interactions within those settings and the work of teachers to remove barriers through meaningful interactions with students. Now, for those tutoring sessions with David, those dry erase markers that are circled on the screen were my primary teaching tool. In that era, you really could only get the red, green, and blue, black markers, but I knew that most of the faculty at St. Mary's, and yes, I am now a faculty member at the place where I did my undergrad degree, used black on the newly installed whiteboards. So my addition of the other colors, to me, was one small step for support for David. I later learned that going to the board more often, linking the visual version of the language with the spoken form, really helped him sort through a lot of the challenges he was having with the sound-symbol relationship. So did color. I assigned green to female nouns and adjective forms and red to masculine. Simple strategies that help students make connections in a language's patterns are often a part of our daily practice, and in general are a solid step towards more inclusive practice. And because of that, we can't underestimate the power of simple teaching methods, well planned and consistently used in making our classrooms more inclusive. Let's meet Mary. I met Mary 2 years later. She was a freshman in French 101, and I was now officially the departmental tutor for French. She told me in our first meeting that she had a learning disability in auditory processing, which meant that the very conversation-heavy language class was, in her words, an avalanche of nonsensical sounds. She had studied Latin in high school, but because our campus did not offer Latin, she had to pick another language. She chose French because she really wanted to go to Paris someday. Mary asked the professor for a tutor after her first quiz, once she saw all of the issues with spelling French. Broadly, she could follow meaning of the messages, but when the heavily oral classroom instruction got tested through written use of the language, everything fell apart for her. A brief detour. I don't remember how it came up in her class, but Mary encountered this word very early in her French language learning career. This word, in a nutshell, shows the challenge of learning French when your brain spends a lot of energy lining up with sounds or symbols, whether visually or auditorily. So this was for both David and Mary, actually. For those who don't know, it's the plural form of birds, and the letters are sounded out as oiseaux and is pronounced as oiseaux. French, like English, is an opaque language. Our alphabet does not line up with the sounds the symbols produce once they show up in a word. Further, the sounds change with accent marks or according to all of the letters around it. There are rules and many exceptions to the rules, and for those of us who teach French, we often end up apologizing for the language's pronunciation rules at some point. French and English both require their users to have strong memories to keep track of those rules, and my work with Mary helped me see the need to explain the same thing different ways and draw on different supports to help increase the retention of the information. In fact, it was the same thing that I experienced with David, but just with different tools needed to get to the same goal. Mary was anxious in the classroom because the sounds she was hearing were not lining up with the words she was seeing in the textbook when she was allowed to look at the textbook in class, or on the rare moment when the instructor wrote on the board. When we met for the tutoring sessions, her book was open and I was constantly using my trusty colored dry erase markers, alphabet magnets, and sandpaper to try to help her build a bridge between the visual and spoken side of class. In fact, it was the same thing with David, but in some ways reverse. I started compiling pictures from magazines and cheap clip art CD-ROMs so I could illustrate the vocabulary without relying on English. These were all techniques I tried based on 2 points she shared with me. She wanted to be immersed in French so that she could spend as much time as possible working on her sound symbol understanding, and she needed different ways to see and experience the sounds and symbols. Both of those recommendations came to me from her because of how she had approached learning English in the K-12 system because of how she worked with auditory processing at the time. As was the case with David, those two starting points ended up being critical for how I continued to frame and explore inclusive teaching practice in language classrooms. It took the assumption off the table that English must be used in order to include students, and it further propelled the point that inclusion within a classroom is highly dependent on what is and is not happening instructionally to make the content accessible within a class. This was a different version of the same struggle David had reported. Consequently, some of the research lessons I've learned since that trace to my experience with Mary are: the transparency or opacity of a language needs to be considered when we're supporting sound-symbol connections. And just a step further, it's something we should be thinking about when we're designing supports for our students in the classroom. If we have to do a lot to remember all of the rules and exceptions to the rules, it points to a need to make sure that your class has a lot of mnemonic-based supports and other memory tools. The affective filter of a learner in the language setting will certainly shape their receptiveness to learning and influence motivation, themes that we've seen from the early work of Krashen and Terrell around the affective filter hypothesis and in different threads of motivational research on language learning. Mary's emotions about learning, she was consistently overwhelmed in class and had to work to stay calm so that she could try to receive whatever language she could in class. Simultaneous multimodal instruction can help many students code break in the language, and it supports retention of the target language. We saw this in our use with the alphabet magnets and the sandpaper, where Mary was tracing her finger over the sandpaper while she was saying the sounds and the words that she was working with. It's all about trying to help her build memory of some unusual relationships. It was also important, and we've seen this in other threads of research, that maximizing the target language. Extensive switching between English and the target language is often cognitively inefficient for students who have slower processing speeds. They don't always follow that a sandwich is being made in the language classroom, for those of you who get that reference of target language, English, target language. Also, one of the lessons learned from working with Mary was that we have to be conscious of the barriers that are created by teaching one particular way all the time and restricting students' access to certain resources during their learning. Her instructor regularly did not allow the students to look at the book. They only had to hear French in the class session. And we also need to be mindful of the arc of how we teach students to learn the language and the way we test them on that skill. There was a massive disconnect between how she had to hear it in class versus how she had to be tested on it in writing. and that was a huge challenge for her work in the classroom. My work with Mary that year attracted a lot of attention from the faculty in the French department and ultimately led to the creation of a 2-volume manual for the department that was used to support the inclusion of other students in French classes. The empty binder that's there, it actually has some of my books hiding in it, was the collection of materials I either made or found to help the instructors have a bigger toolbox of resources to use. If I had brought the actual contents of that binder on the plane when I did the keynote, the baggage fees would have been ridiculous. To a larger degree, inclusive teaching is facilitated by having a large toolbox of resources from which to draw. Being able to have multiple ways to explain or explore an idea or a communicative function allows us to meet students at different entry points to their work. And let's be honest, it also encourages the teacher pack rat tendencies that I know many language teachers have. To this day, I cannot bring myself to throw out many of my FSL teaching resources. Finally, let's meet Melissa and Emmanuel. For my K-12 teaching days, there were dozens of students I could have used as exemplars. In fact, 2 others were in this talk until my time limits were clarified as I finalized this recording. I reshuffled this section a bit because I felt the need to invite Melissa and Emmanuel to the table together. First, some context. Room B204 was my high school classroom. Melissa and Emmanuel were 2 of the 23 students in my Period 2 French 1 class. 19 of the 23 students had previously tried Spanish to some degree. 6 of the students had 504 plans. 5 had IEPs. 1 student was gifted and on an accelerated curriculum elsewhere in the school. 1 student had just arrived from Guatemala. The students were a mix of 9th through 12th graders, and the class was 70-30, male to female. When I got my class roster at the start of the year, there was a note for me to track down the special education chair at the school. Before I even finished asking her why she needed to see me, she started talking about Emmanuel. She wanted me to know that this student's experience with oppositional defiant disorder was pretty extreme, and because of his physically violent behaviors in previous schools, he'd been removed from 14 schools in the last 2 years. She wanted me to know about this because the decision to place him in my French class was made solely because my room was right next door to the school SRO. There's lots about that introduction to Emmanuel that could be unpacked here, and especially in the current moment we are historically in our country should be unpacked further. But I want to focus on the fact that I immediately shut down thinking about how I could reach this student and make French a positive experience for him when I heard those details, and I heard that diagnosis. In my conversations with teachers over the years about inclusive practices in classrooms, fear and uncertainty are often underlying emotions, and I want to bring them to this table as well. We need to confront them as part of this journey. Melissa joined my class a month into the school year as a senior. She had spent the first month of the year in a Spanish 1 class, but for a variety of reasons, a schedule change was needed. Melissa, as her name is written here in Braille, was blind and attending our high school on a temporary program out of the Maryland School for the Blind. Her time in our school was designed to focus on her increased skills with orientation and mobility training and learning how to navigate a larger sighted world. Her IEP called for a full academic program, as I had been told by the special ed chair yet again. However, I met Melissa before I saw her IEP, so I asked her what support she wanted to use to help unlock French. She was building her skills with Braille, which, despite being invented by a Frenchman, lacks an accent system. And she told me that she knew it took an average of 3 weeks to get materials converted at the MSB. She said she could still see very bright colors, and because she had only started to lose her sight at 12, she knew the English alphabet. We agreed that she'd start out by listening to what was going on, and we'd figure out what she needed to do assignment-wise and work-wise once she had a feel for how the class was running and I had a better handle on what her needs were. I sat her next to Emmanuel. Admittedly, I hadn't engaged much with Emmanuel in that first month out of fear. There were the basic interactions for running a class and calling on him here and there, but I didn't do much to pull him into the class. He really hadn't misbehaved in my class either, but that warning from the chair had stuck with me. I was scared that my actions would set him off. During that first class with Melissa, something visibly shifted in him. 5 minutes after the class started, I saw him leaning over, asking her if she needed help getting out her materials, which at the time was her Braille computer. As the class unfolded, the students were expected to pair off for activities, and he asked to work with her. Circulating around the room, I noticed he was trying to describe the pictures he had in his hands to her without any prompting from me. He was using a mix of French and English. Seeing this, I walked over and asked how everything was going. Melissa said that her new friend Emmanuel was really helping her get settled in, and he smiled a huge smile, and I felt horrible for not having thought of him as a student in any sort of positive way. Over the year, Emmanuel and Melissa's connection changed the core of that class. A mix of multiple bomb threats that year and a broken down Brailler at the MSB for high volume conversion meant other technologies were needed to help Melissa see parts of French. Glitter-glued vocabulary cards became a regular feature, and Emmanuel organized the system. He was determined to help Melissa in French class by helping make and keep straight all of those cards we used to help her see the language. He asked to have his flash pass reworked so that he can come to my class, not the guidance office, to help make sure the system was tended to properly. At first, I saw him 3 times a week on that system, just like he had gone into the guidance office. But then it eventually dropped to once every other week, and then not at all. His behavior stopped being an issue at all in school. Melissa would share tips with her classmates about how she was learning French without seeing it in the same way, and talked about how she was trying all of these new things by being at our high school. At one point, in response to someone complaining about how hard French was, she said with a joking tone, "Try learning it when you only have cardboard glitter glue letters and are stuck out on the football field during a bomb threat." By early January, the class had started to hum as a cohesive group. They'd seen different ways I'd been trying to help them figure out French, and they also started to see how their various approaches to learning were complementary to each other. We started to talk about our classroom as an all-you-can-eat buffet, where everyone ended up with different items on their plate as class unfolded, but at the end, they were mostly satisfied because, again, they were high school students. You can't expect total satisfaction. Full disclosure, it wasn't always sunshine and rainbows, and there were still difficult days for many students and me as we navigated all of the different levels of needs and challenges, but that French 1 class and the dynamic duo of Melissa and Emmanuel pointed me in the direction of several other important understandings from the research. A teacher's view of disability and difference and how their own view of their teaching can or cannot respond to the student needs will greatly shape the extent to which classroom interactions are inclusive. Because of what I had internalized about Emmanuel's experience with ODD, I did not engage in the kinds of interactions that treated him like an equal student from an academic standpoint because of the way that diagnosis was culturated into me. DC and Ryan's theory of self-determination helps us understand that student growth in the classroom experience is a combination of competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And through the narrative that you heard about Emmanuel and Melissa, you could see different ways that their competence, relatedness, and autonomy was supported within the classroom community. The other piece I want to acknowledge that for many students with disabilities, particularly male children of color, and that was Emmanuel, a lot of decisions are made about what they can and cannot do based on past histories rather than new opportunities. This is structural racism in action, and this is something that we need to do better as in schools overall to support our children's diverse backgrounds and learning needs. In closing, I want to highlight a few final points about inclusive practices within the world language classroom. Best practices in world language and second language instruction are tightly aligned with what is already considered emblematic of inclusive practice. World language teachers, I have found, are the group of teachers you have to sometimes least explain the strategies that are outlined in an IEP, because so many of them are focused on organizing information, working with language in more tactile and representative ways. Concerns and questions about inclusion in our programs intersect with bigger issues about our field's place within the larger curriculum, societal expectations and values around multilingualism, and in general, who can or should be expected to study other languages. No doubt, these are large forces we have to address, among others, but it is already within the knowledge and talents of the people in this room and watching this screencast to enact inclusive practices and experiences for world language instruction. You can do this, and chances are you already are doing this. The hum of activity in room B204 and my experiences as a scholar in this field have confirmed that inclusion is a process, not a destination. The glitter cards, pipe cleaners, silly putty eggs, picture cards, envelope activities, everything that landed on the table, still show up in my teaching even at the graduate level. New technologies and new understandings about student learning, identity, and community have added in other resources and ways to think through my teaching and how it is or is not inclusive. My table is never going to be fully set. The place settings will get bigger and more chairs will wait in the wings to be pulled up as more dishes are added to the table as well. And I can't wait to meet those students and opportunities who will help me continue to innovate my teaching. Thank you.